The streets of Istanbul in the summer of 1826 carried a strange tension. Merchants whispered in hushed tones, women hurried past bazaars with downcast eyes, and soldiers in the Sultan's service seemed to carry themselves with unusual purpose. Something was brewing, and everyone could feel it. For centuries, the Janissaries had been both the pride and plague of the Ottoman Empire. Once, they were the fiercest warriors in the Sultan's name, taken as boys, trained into an elite corps and feared across Europe and Asia. But now they had grown arrogant, defiant, and dangerous even to the throne they were meant to protect. By the reign of Sultan Mahmud II, the Janissaries were no longer loyal guardians of the empire. They had turned into power-hungry mercenaries who resisted reform, toppled viziers, and even deposed sultans. They had become a state within a state, untouchable and corrupt. Mahmud II knew that as long as the Janissaries existed, his empire would never modernize. He dreamed of a disciplined army modeled after Europe's regiments, but the Janissaries despised such reforms. For them, modernization meant the loss of their privileges, wealth, and unchecked authority. In June of 1826, the Sultan made his move. He announced the creation of a new modern army called the Asakir-i-Mansure-i Muhammadiyeh, the victorious soldiers of Muhammad. It was a bold declaration, a challenge written in fire to the Janissaries, who had always resisted change. The Janissaries erupted with fury. They gathered in their barracks, shouting, pounding their drums of revolt. For centuries, the beating of those kettle drums had meant rebellion. Now their thunder rolled across the city like an omen of blood. Crowds gathered outside the barracks, fearful yet curious. The Janissaries overturned cauldrons, a symbolic act of mutiny known as Kazan Kaldırmak. It was their way of declaring war against the Sultan himself. Mahmud II had anticipated this. He had already gathered loyal troops, artillery, and the support of the ulama, the religious scholars. He stood before the clerics, who declared the Janissaries heretics for rebelling against their sovereign. With religion on his side, the Sultan prepared to strike. On June 15th, the Janissaries marched from their barracks, armed and shouting, demanding that the Sultan abandon his reforms. Their once proud ranks now looked like a mob of thugs, but their numbers still terrified the city. The Sultan climbed to the balcony of the Seraglio Palace, his eyes burning with cold determination. He raised the sacred banner of the Prophet Muhammad, the Sancak Sharif. This was not just politics now, it was holy war. The sight of the sacred banner electrified the city. Ordinary citizens, loyal soldiers, and imams poured into the streets to defend the Sultan. The Janissaries, once feared as untouchable, now faced an enraged population united against them. Mahmud II gave the order. Cannons were wheeled into position, their barrels aimed at the Janissary barracks. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. The time for mercy had ended. As the Janissaries regrouped inside their lodgings, the first cannon thundered. A ball of iron smashed through timber and flesh, setting the wooden structures ablaze. Screams filled the air as fire and smoke rose over Istanbul. The Janissaries tried to fight back, but they were trapped. Loyal troops cut off their escape routes, while artillery tore holes in their defenses. The once mighty warriors of the empire found themselves burning in their own barracks. Inside, the fire spread with terrifying speed. Oil lamps, gunpowder stores, and wooden beams turned the barracks into an inferno. Some Janissaries leapt from windows, only to be cut down by waiting soldiers. Others were crushed as walls collapsed around them. The Sultan watched from a distance, his face expressionless. To him, this was not cruelty, but necessity. For too long, the Janissaries had strangled the empire with their corruption. Now their screams were the sound of chains breaking. Outside the burning barracks, captured Janissaries were dragged into the streets. Some begged for mercy, others cursed the Sultan with their dying breath. None were spared. They were cut down, beaten, or strangled where they stood. The people of Istanbul joined in the slaughter. Citizens who had long suffered under Janissary bullying now turned on their tormentors. Stones, knives, and fists rained down upon the once feared soldiers. Revenge had come with a fury no cannon could match. By nightfall, the streets were littered with corpses. The fires still burned, casting a crimson glow over the city. The Janissaries, once the untouchable guardians of the empire, had been reduced to ash and blood in a single day. But Mahmud II knew this was only the beginning. Thousands had died, yet many more remained scattered across the empire. He would have to hunt them down, root out every survivor, and erase their legacy from history itself. Still, for the first time in centuries, the throne of the Ottoman Sultan was free from Janissary tyranny. The age of fear was ending, and a new age, an age written in fire and iron, was beginning. The people went to sleep that night with smoke still in the air, the sound of crackling flames still echoing in their ears. They had witnessed the unthinkable, the destruction of the Janissaries, the once immortal cause of the empire. And yet, deep in the shadows, survivors plotted revenge. The Sultan had struck a mortal blow, but the embers of rebellion still smoldered. The purge had only just begun. When the dawn broke over Istanbul, the city reeked of smoke and death. The Janissary barracks still smoldered, their charred remains blackened against the sky. The cries of widows and the silence of ruined streets told the story better than any proclamation. The once mighty core was broken, but the Sultan knew their shadow still lingered. Mahmud II wasted no time. He ordered his soldiers, the newly loyal regiments and city guards, to scour the streets. Surviving Janissaries were to be captured or executed on sight. No hesitation, no trial. The decree was as ruthless as it was final. The hunt began with a fury. Squads of armed men kicked down doors, stormed into coffeehouses, and dragged out anyone suspected of wearing the Janissary sash. Those caught were beaten in the open, sometimes before crowds who cheered their downfall. Their heads rolled in the streets as a warning to others. Citizens, emboldened by the Sultan's banner, joined in the pursuit. Shopkeepers who had once paid bribes to Janissaries now pointed them out to soldiers. Old grudges resurfaced with sharpened knives. Neighbors betrayed neighbors, eager to rid themselves of men who had terrorized the city for decades. In the Sultan's court, Mahmud II received reports with cold satisfaction. He demanded that the purge spread beyond Istanbul. Messengers were dispatched across the empire with a single order. The Janissaries must be annihilated wherever they lived. The reach of the purge was terrifying. In the provinces, garrisons were surrounded, and Janissaries slaughtered like trapped beasts. In some cities, local militias lit their barracks on fire, repeating the inferno that had consumed Istanbul. Smoke rose across the empire as the core was erased, province by province. Those who surrendered were no more fortunate. They were paraded in chains, spat upon by crowds, and dragged before executioners. Some were strangled with bowstrings, the Ottoman method reserved for traitors. Others were flayed alive or beaten to death by mobs drunk on vengeance. The Sultan ordered their leaders seized and tortured. Captains who had commanded Janissary ranks were hung from hooks, burned with hot irons, and forced to confess their supposed plots against the throne. Even those who begged for loyalty were silenced. There was no forgiveness left in Mahmud's heart. In Istanbul, the purge took on a theatre of terror. Captured Janissaries were lined up in public squares, their throats slit one by one. The cobblestones ran red as citizens gathered, not in horror, but in grim celebration. The Sultan had given them justice, and they embraced it with bloodied hands. Those who tried to flee faced their own kind of torment. Some Janissaries disguised themselves as peasants, hiding in villages, but they were hunted relentlessly. Informants exposed them, and their disguises were torn away before they were executed in the open fields. Others attempted escape by sea, bribing fishermen to carry them across the Bosphorus, but Ottoman patrols intercepted boats, dragging desperate men back to shore. Their punishment was worse than death. Tied to planks, they were left to burn slowly in the sun before executioners delivered the final blow. For Mahmud II, this was not only a military purge, it was an erasure. He ordered their property confiscated, their archives destroyed, their banners torn down. Even the word Janissary became forbidden in official speech. They were to vanish from memory as if they had never existed. But memory was harder to kill than men. Whispers spread of hidden groups, of Janissaries who had survived and sworn vengeance. In taverns and secret halls, the ghost of the core still stirred. Some citizens, though grateful for freedom, feared the Sultan's wrath as much as they once feared the soldiers. The Sultan's own methods grew darker. Suspected sympathizers were tortured until they gave up names. Families of Janissaries were torn apart, their sons executed, their daughters enslaved or sold. The purge was no longer just about warriors. It had become a war on bloodlines. Yet Mahmud II did not waver. To him, this was holy work, a cleansing fire that would purify the empire. The ulama continued to back him, declaring that the Janissaries had become enemies of God. The Sultan wrapped his cruelty in righteousness, and so it was accepted. By midsummer, Istanbul was transformed. The barracks were ruins, the streets quieter than they had been in centuries. Citizens who had lived in fear of Janissary extortion now walked freely, though their freedom had been purchased in rivers of blood. Still, fear lingered. Torture chambers beneath the palace were filled with the groans of prisoners. Men were stretched on racks, whipped until their flesh split, and branded with hot irons. The Sultan wanted confessions of conspiracies, whether true or not, to justify the scale of his vengeance. The purge had given him absolute control. With the Janissaries gone, no one dared challenge his reforms. But power won through blood demanded more blood. He had tasted victory through annihilation, and the empire trembled under the shadow of his will. Survivors who slipped through the cracks became outlaws, hunted men. Some fled into the Balkans, where they told tales of the Sultan's cruelty, hoping to rouse Christian powers against him. Others hid within the empire, gathering quietly, dreaming of revenge that would never come. But for the Sultan, this was only the second act. He had burned the heart of the Janissaries, hunted their remnants, and silenced their allies. Now he would ensure that even their memory would be choked from history itself. And so the fires that had started in Istanbul spread across the empire, not of rebellion but of obliteration. The Janissary name became a curse, their symbols outlawed, their blood spilled until the streets could drink no more. Mahmud II had struck with cannons and fire, but the greatest cruelty was yet to come. The purge was not over, it was only deepening. The summer sun bore down on Istanbul as if the heavens themselves watched in judgment. Weeks had passed since the barracks burned, yet the city still smelled of charred wood and flesh. The people whispered that the empire had changed forever, that the blood of the Janissaries had soaked into its very stones. Mahmud II had achieved what none of his predecessors dared. The Janissaries, once the guardians of the Ottoman throne, once the terror of kings in Europe, were shattered. But to the Sultan their death was not enough. Their memory, their spirit, their very shadow had to be erased. Across the empire, the Sultan's decrees spread like fire. Governors received sealed orders demanding they root out any remnant of Janissary influence. Old lodges were torn down, their banners ripped and burned in public squares. Even the cauldrons that symbolized their brotherhood were melted into cannonballs. But the Sultan's war was not only against objects, it was against flesh. Survivors dragged from hiding were subjected to torments meant to break their pride. Men were impaled outside city gates, their bodies left to rot as a warning. Others were bound and hurled into flames, a mirror of the barracks where so many had already burned. In the dungeons of Istanbul, the screams never ceased. Torturers forced prisoners onto racks, tearing joints apart until confessions spilled from broken lips. Iron hooks tore flesh from bone. Hot oil was poured slowly upon the backs of those accused of conspiracy. Each cry echoed the Sultan's command. The Janissaries must cease to exist. The Sultan spared no rank, no title. Aga after Aga, the senior commanders of the corps, were hunted and destroyed. One was dragged naked through the streets, whipped until his skin hung in tatters before being strangled with a bowstring in the palace courtyard. Another was burned alive inside a metal cage, the fire lit by citizens who once cowered before him. Families suffered alongside the soldiers. Sons of Janissaries were executed to prevent revenge. Wives and daughters were seized, some forced into slavery, others left to beg on the streets. Entire bloodlines were condemned as polluted, erased in the name of imperial survival. The Sultan called this the Auspicious Incident, as if history itself would one day record it as fortune. Yet the people saw rivers of blood where he claimed providence. They saw corpses piled at city gates, their eyes staring blankly at the sun. They saw neighbors vanish in the night, accused of sympathies they may never have held. And still, the purge deepened. In distant provinces, entire villages accused of harboring Janissaries were burned to the ground. Men were crucified on city walls, left to die beneath circling vultures. In some towns, survivors were buried alive, their muffled screams rising from the earth as their graves became their prisons. The terror seeped into every corner of the empire. Merchants trembled to speak of the old order. Poets who once praised Janissary valor now wrote in silence, afraid their words would bring death to their families. Even imams preached carefully, their sermons heavy with loyalty to the Sultan's cleansing fire. Mahmud II walked through his palace with cold triumph. His enemies were dust, his reforms unchallenged. He had broken the backbone of rebellion, and the empire bent to his will. Yet power came at a cost. The empire's soul trembled under the weight of its own violence. Foreign envoys wrote of the massacre with horror. In Vienna, in London, in Paris, whispers spread that the Sultan had turned against his own soldiers with fire and cannon. But none could deny the result. An empire once paralyzed by mutiny was now ruled with an iron fist. In Istanbul, the silence after the storm was deafening. No more Janissary drums thundered rebellion. No more kettle cauldrons signaled revolt. The city that once shook with their arrogance now lay strangely still, haunted by the ghosts of men burned alive. Yet among the ashes, memory survived. Old men whispered stories of Janissary glory, of campaigns across Hungary and Persia, of loyalty before corruption consumed them. Some said the core had died not by fire, but by betrayal, that the Sultan had destroyed his own protectors to crown himself in blood. For the survivors scattered in exile, the purge became legend. In taverns of the Balkans they swore oaths of vengeance, though few had the strength to act. Their pride had been broken, their power stripped, their families slaughtered. They were remnants of an empire within an empire, reduced to dust by a single stroke of will. The Sultan ordered monuments raised not to honor the Janissaries, but to bury them. Their names were struck from records, their insignias ground into the earth. What once stood as the empire's shield became its eternal shame. But erasure is never perfect. The blood on the streets could not be washed away, nor could the cries of men burning in their barracks be forgotten by those who heard them. Children who witnessed the purge would tell the tale to their children, and so the memory lived on in whispers, in fear, in shadows. Mahmud II had succeeded in purging the Janissaries, but his victory came with a haunting price. He ruled an empire stripped of one of its oldest institutions, its history scorched and rewritten. Power was his, absolute and unquestioned, but it rested on foundations built of fire and bone. And so the story of the Janissary Purge ended not in silence, but in smoke that never truly cleared. An army that once shook the world was reduced to ashes, and a sultan etched his name in history with the screams of his own men. The empire endured, but the streets of Istanbul would forever remember the day the Sultan burned his guardians alive. Subscribe the channel for more interesting content like this.